Good evening. This evening I want to talk about Chapter 3 of the Do Ask Do Tell book. That's this. And it starts with a discussion to have a visit with a strip mine of my own with a former KU roommate before it gets into the meat of the chapter. This is the period of my life between the time I got out of the Army and the time that I was back in the Washington area in the early 1990s and starting to work on the gays in the military. And that's what's not included in the major film proposals, which focus on the forced intimacy issue. In college and in the military and in other areas of life. So this was not included, so this would be like a separate film almost. But so let's just start. I remember, like, on the last day when I was in the Army, I drove away, in my car that I bought from my father, Ford Galaxy, to the 170 miles back up to Arlington where the home is, and the music was playing Everybody's Beautiful in Their Own Way. That's the Army Museum there. And I eventually would have my honorable discharge and all the paperwork and everything. And I started my first job at RCA in the middle of February of 1970. And I would live in about 8 miles east of Princeton, and it was called Cranberry then. This is actually a lake in Hightstown, New Jersey, and that looks like the Princeton Arms apartments that I would actually move into. My first apartment, the rent would be $165 a month. I was in an upstairs bedroom, and I remember waking up on a Saturday morning, in late February. My parents had been there the day before to help me move and brought the car up, and I had taken them to the train station. This was my first day in my life as a young adult. I was in my bedroom, and the sun was coming in through the blinders, and my record collection was in the bedroom, and my mirror cord, and things that meant a lot to me in my life were there. I would be working for, and this was Princeton, just the argument, I'll get back to that. I would be working in working for RCA, the David Sarnoff Research Center, which was just east of downtown Princeton. I don't have a picture of that now. And then I would be going on several assignments to different RCA plants to try to get a permanent position in operations research. So that was the first job. And we actually had a model of allocating production, and we were going to code it in Fortran for the RCA television plant in Indiana, in Indianapolis. That's Brown County State Park. I think I've shown you that before. There's downtown Indianapolis on Washington Street, Washington Meridian. And the plant, where the plant was, is about 30th Street, is now a zoo. The plant was eventually torn down. But the project was not really successful. It wasn't really thought out. It wasn't really thought out particularly well. But a lot of things about my personality started to show. Did I say that as I was driving away, when I got out of the Army, the radio was playing Everybody, Without Love, They're Good or Nothing at All. I remember that. It was playing Without Love. And that kind of set the tone for what would happen. I've explained in a previous video that I was very wrapped in affiliating with people that I thought were males, that I thought were superior to me. And I would tend to be attached to one person and want to find that affiliation. And then I went through several cycles of that in my life. and I would tend to be critical of people, or feel critical of people who weren't physically any better than I was, and wondered how in the world did they get married. People would say, well, wait, when somebody gets married, they'll gain weight and they don't care about their appearance anymore. And men in those days didn't. And I would tend to make remarks about that. And in those days, it was more acceptable to make remarks today that might seem offensive. In those days, it was more offensive to make remarks that were critical of people than it is today. But I may have sort of gotten bad reputation saying that. I didn't want to live in Indianapolis. It didn't seem like a place for me. I liked living in Princeton, though. Excuse me. And then there was another assignment down in Cherry Hill. I don't really have a picture of Cherry Hill. It's across the river from Philadelphia. But here's Pittman, New Jersey, where Tim Pool tried to have an event. That's a long story in 2019. That's not too far away for some scenery. And so eventually I got laid off at the end, because they didn't really find an assignment for me. So at the end of in the early 1971, I was lucky enough that there was a chess player that I had made good friends with when I was playing chess at GW, as I talked about in the last video, the Do Ask Do Tell show. I talked about worked at Naval Command Systems Support Activity, which was in the Washington Navy Yard, and so I got a job fairly easy as a GS-11, and I was making $11,168 a year. I was at RCA. I was making $13,500. And here I was making $2,000 a year less as a GS-11. I think was it 11 or was it a 9? I'm not sure. I thought it was an 11. But and I got an apartment on Columbia Pike it was $5 a month cheaper than it had been in New Jersey. It was $160 a month. I didn't mention that in New Jersey I had a cat that came by all the time and begged and sort of sponged off of me, But that's another thing. But anyway, so I worked here for a year and a half. There's another picture of the Navy Yard. And we worked on a simulation model for intercepting missiles. And the idea was to influence the SALT talks that were going on. This was 1971. It was 9 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis when Nixon was president. And at that time, Nixon still had a reasonably decent reputation. Then the inflation started. The inflation was starting, and the price controls were starting. And there's my hiring paper, actually. During that time, two interesting things happened. I made another good friend that I emulated who was tall and handsome. He was married, and his wife they invited me over to dinner a couple times. And his wife wanted me to become a hippie, so that she thought that if I became a hippie, I could attract women, because I couldn't attract women as I was. So that was how they felt. But about in the same time, I started becoming concerned about strip mining in West Virginia. We're starting to hear about that in the papers, so I started driving out, like along Route 50. You can drive up onto the Allegheny Front to about 4,000 feet, and this is a place called Saddle Mountain, and then you can see some of the evidences of strip mining. These pictures I took in 2012. These are old. They were taken in November after Hurricane Sandy. But generally, in those days, you could see lots of areas where the reclamation hadn't gotten very far yet. Particularly west of Mount Storm, West Virginia, which I've shown before, I think. And one time I was taking pictures of it, and coal company person came along and almost made a citizen's arrest. Excuse me. And drove me around and showed me where reclamation was happening. That was July 31, 1971. And then later on, started dating women. There were two women that I dated. One was, they both lived in Maryland. One of them lived in Silver Spring and lived in a small house with her family. And because I looked very thin then, her father tried to give me a sandwich before he went out. I still remember that. But we went on about 6 or 7 dates, and I joked. I took her to see Bloody Sunday, or Sunday, Bloody Sunday. I'll get to that in a minute. That's New Jersey. I took her to see that, and we talked about the fact that I was supposed to stand on her outside facing traffic. I was supposed to be protective, and we talked about that. We went to see Leonard Bernstein's Mass, was the biggest thing we did. We almost went to the last baseball game that the so-called new Senators played when they forfeited the game when the fans went out in the field because the Senators were moving to Texas. But for some reason, she couldn't go. We almost saw that. And there was another woman who lived in a basement apartment who just wanted somebody to provide for her. And she was much more humble, I guess. That was kind of the way it was. And I started losing interest, even though this friend of mine at work tried to encourage me to date, even though I identified with him. And then finally, he left Nav Cossack and went to work for Univac as an instructor in their software school in Tysons Corner, Virginia. I went to Europe in late July, in mainly Germany and Scandinavia. And when I came back, shortly after I came back, I got a call from a recruiter from Univac, and partly through this friend, and I guess. And I wound up going to work for Univac in Montclair, New Jersey, as a site rep, mostly supporting Fortran and COBOL. And I actually and then wound up working on benchmarks and going to Minneapolis. I actually got some pretty interesting experience there. I've talked about that in another video about work. But I wrote one program in assembler to monitor other programmers' computer use. That was interesting. But this is a scene. This is the Edison House in Caldwell, New Jersey, along Bloomfield Avenue, and I lived on a road that jutted off Bloomfield called Espy Road, and the apartment rent started out being $215 a month, which was more than had been either in Washington, and was more than had been in Princeton. Farther north in New Jersey, the rents were a little bit higher as you got closer to New York City. And I have a few pictures of, there's the office that was on Claremont Avenue in Montclair that Univac had its rep office in. But we actually went and worked on sites of customers. There's two more other scenes from Montclair, New Jersey, about 12 miles maybe from Newark. And we actually worked at Public Service Electric and Gas in downtown Newark. I don't have it in a concrete building, and there was a hotel next to it. It was all next to Penn Station, and so I started going into the city a lot, sometimes for work. I even had an assembler class in New York City. But I started going into the city a lot, and in the course of time, I started learning, finding, particularly on the 2nd of January, a visit in the city. I found a newsstand on the east side with gay magazines in it. I started getting curious, and then in late January of 1973, I went to an MCC service and there had been some kind of incident in New Orleans. It wasn't the New Orleans bar fire, that was later, but they were still raising money for. And so eventually things came to a head. Let me just say something else before I get to this picture, to close out this video. The strip mining issue, I felt that mountains were being defaced by strip mining, that mountains might be torn down completely, and that corresponded to my feeling that the male body shouldn't be defaced, like by shaving. I had talked about in the other Do Ask Do Tell show. There were kind of symbols in my mind about this kind of thing. But anyway, in February, I saw another story about a gay talk group in the Upper West Side. So it was a bitterly cold Sunday afternoon, February the 18th, 1973. Basically my life changed. I decided to take the bus in. There was one bus that went across into New York City by the George Washington Bridge that you could take. It ran once an hour. And at that time, I was real good at knowing the buses and real good at taking them, being on time and everything. So I went in through the George Washington Bridge, went down the subway to the Upper West Side, and went to the talk route, which really had me deciding to come out. And I came out of there, felt like a different person. So I went back the same way, and went back to my apartment. And then that night, we were supposed to go on a business trip back down to Princeton, ironically, for a training course for the next 2 weeks. And that was like maybe 30 miles. We were going to stay in a motel the next 2 weeks. So I went down, and my mind was just, I drove down 287 and eventually over to Princeton and got in the motel. And my mind, it just changed completely. And it was a very happy week for me, actually. And between the 2 weeks of the course, I went up to Vermont that weekend. And that time I wasn't afraid of leaving the apartment alone or anything. I went up and did skiing on Killington Peak and the graduated length method. But that's why I show a picture of the George Washington Bridge. I'd also say something about Newark, just going back. Back in December of 1972, just 2 months before my second coming, that's what I call February 18, 1973, my second coming, I'd gone to a meeting of the People's Party of New Jersey because I was sort of interested in the presidential candidate they had. I felt attracted to him, frankly. And it was in a row house in downtown Newark, or near downtown. Newark had its own subway, by the way, and there was a path and intricate of public transportation all over the place. But I went to a meeting in a row house, and I found how radical the left was even then. This was the People's Party of New Jersey, but it was making demands to end all inherited wealth and making demands to limit the amount that anybody could make in a year to $50,000. Their agenda, and it was very radical and it was very punitive, and they were talking about threatening violence. And I still remember that. That was a night in December of 1972, and I had been skiing that day in western New Jersey before I drove to this place not far from downtown, to this row house, to this meeting. So that's just another side, but to the story. But that's the next little episode I'll take up what happened when I came out and how I moved to New York soon, and the next part of what my life would be like. And I do thank you for listening.